You know, Ryan always said Jake got his smile from him. Time froze. My stomach clenched so hard I thought I might be sick. For a second, I convinced myself I must have misheard her. But then I looked at her face. Her smile disappeared. Her cheeks flushed red. Her eyes went wide like she'd just realized she'd stepped off a cliff. She knew exactly what she had said. Before I could react, before I could even process it, she let out an awkward laugh, stumbled backwards slightly, and turned away. She called out to one of the guests about how cute their daughter's dress was, then disappeared into the crowd of laughing parents and shrieking kids. I stood there frozen, clutching a half-empty plastic cup, watching her mingle like nothing had happened. Ryan. My coworker. My so-called friend. Jake ran past me with a balloon tied to his wrist, laughing like the happiest kid in the world. His smile, a smile I'd always thought was mine, suddenly felt like a question mark hanging in the air. The rest of the party was a fog. I saw people talking to me, felt hands patting my shoulder, but I couldn't hear a word. Every time I looked at Emily, she avoided my gaze. She poured herself more wine, threw her head back laughing at some dad's joke, and floated through the party like she hadn't just detonated a bomb in my chest. When the last guest finally left, Emily kicked off her heels and started cleaning up. Her lipstick was smudged, her hair falling out of her bun, but she looked casual. Too casual. "David, can you grab the trash bags?" she said over her shoulder. I didn't move. I just stood there, staring at her. She finally turned around, wine glass in hand, her smile wavering when she noticed the look on my face. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice a little too light, her grip on the glass a little too tight. I shook my head and walked past her, grabbing a trash bag and stepping out into the cold night air. The chill hit me like a slap, but it didn't do anything to stop the storm in my head. Ryan. Jake. Emily. My mind was a whirlpool of fragments and questions, none of them with answers. That night, I lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling. Emily had gone to bed without another word. I heard her moving around upstairs, the faint creak of the floorboards, then silence. But I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard her voice again. Ryan always said Jake got his smile from him. When the sun crept through the blinds, I was still awake. I could hear Emily moving around in the kitchen, the sound of mugs clinking together and the faint hum of the coffee machine. I walked in, and there she was, hair tied up, wearing her robe, holding a steaming mug of coffee. She froze when she saw me. "Emily," I said, my voice low and steady. "What did you mean last night?" "About Jake's smile." Her face drained of color instantly. She put the mug down, her hand trembling slightly. "David. I don't know. I was drunk. I was just talking nonsense. You know how I get after too much wine." "No," I said, stepping closer. "No, this wasn't nonsense. You said it, and you meant it. Why would Ryan ever say something like that about our son?" Her eyes welled up with tears, but I wasn't letting her off the hook this time. "Look at me, Emily. Look at me." She flinched but lifted her eyes to meet mine. I don't. "David, please. You're overthinking it. It was a stupid joke. I'm sorry." "A joke? Are you serious right now?" "That wasn't a joke, Emily. That was something real. You said it, and now I need you to tell me why." Her face crumpled, and tears started spilling down her cheeks. She sank into one of the kitchen chairs, burying her face in her hands. I can't do this right now," she whispered. I slammed my hand down on the counter, the sound sharp and final. She jumped. "No. You will do this right now. Because I'm not going to sit around pretending like you didn't just blow my world apart." She lifted her head, her eyes red and swollen, but she didn't say anything. I stared at her for what felt like forever, waiting for her to speak, to explain, to do something. But she stayed silent. Finally, I turned and walked away. I went upstairs, into our bedroom, and shut the door behind me. The morning after Emily's slip-up at Jake's birthday party, I sat in my car outside our office parking lot, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Ryan worked in the same building as me, just a few floors away. I could have walked up there, grabbed him by his overpriced tie, and demanded answers right then and there. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed frozen in my car, staring at the dashboard, because deep down, I was terrified of what he might say. Was it true? Was Jake his son? I couldn't bring myself to face him, not yet. So I drove away. That night, Emily acted like nothing had happened. She cooked dinner, helped Jake with his homework, and chatted about some new Netflix show she wanted to start watching together. It was all so normal, and it made me sick. After Jake went to bed, I cornered her in the kitchen. Emily, we're not done talking about this. She froze mid-scrub over a plate, her shoulders stiff. David, please. I told you it was just wine talking. You're overthinking. No. I cut her off, my voice low but firm. You don't get to brush this off. Not this. I want the truth, Emily. And I want it now. She turned to face me, and for a second, I thought she might actually tell me. But instead, she started crying. Her face crumpled, and she shook her head. Why are you doing this? Why are you trying to ruin everything, David? We're fine. Jake is happy. Can't we just? No. My voice cracked, and I slammed my hand on the counter. We can't. Because every time I look at Jake now, I see him. And every time I look at you, I see a liar. Emily's tears spilled freely then, but I didn't care. You're hiding something, I said through gritted teeth. And whether you tell me or not, I'm going to find out. I grabbed my keys and left the house. I didn't have a plan, I just drove. My mind kept going back to Ryan, his smug smile, the way he always clapped Jake on the back a little too hard, the way Emily laughed at his jokes. That night, I slept in a cheap motel room off the highway. The room smelled like bleach and regret. I stared at the ceiling for hours before pulling out my phone and opening an old photo of Jake and me at the park. His smile was so bright, his little hand wrapped tightly around mine. But now, all I could see was Ryan's face staring back at me. The next day, I made a decision. I couldn't keep drowning in questions, I needed answers. Real ones. So I did something I never thought I'd do, I ordered a paternity test. I swabbed Jake's cheek while Emily was at the grocery store. He thought it was some silly game, giggling as I tickled his cheek with the cotton swab. Daddy, that tickles, he said, laughing. My stomach twisted as I forced a smile. Just a little game, buddy. I mailed the test that afternoon. The waiting period was unbearable. Every day felt like an eternity. Emily seemed to sense something was off. She'd started watching me closely, her movements more hesitant, her words more careful. One night, she came into the living room while I was staring at an old family photo. David, are you okay? I didn't answer. I just looked at her and shook my head. Please don't do this, she whispered. Don't let this destroy us. But it was already too late. The results arrived a week later in a plain white envelope. I sat at the kitchen table with it in front of me, my hands shaking as I tore it open. There it was, in black and white, probability of paternity, 0%. Jake wasn't mine. The floor felt like it had been ripped out from under me. My stomach turned, and I stumbled to the sink just in time to throw up. Emily walked in, carrying a basket of laundry. She froze when she saw me, her face going pale. David, what is that? I held up the paper, my hand trembling. It's the truth, Emily. The truth. She dropped the basket, clothes spilling across the floor. David, please, let me explain. Explain. I barked out a laugh. There's nothing to explain. This paper says everything. Jake isn't mine. Tears streamed down her face, but I felt nothing but anger, cold and sharp. How long, Emily? I asked, my voice deadly quiet. How long have you been lying to me? Was it one night? Was it months? Years? She covered her face with her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. It was a mistake, David. I was lonely. You were always working, always distant. Ryan was there, and it just happened. But it didn't mean anything. It's you I love. Her words didn't touch me. They felt empty, hollow. You don't get to say that, I said. You don't get to talk about love while you've been lying to me every single day of our lives. She fell to her knees, clutching at my shirt, but I pulled away. I can't look at you right now. I can't even breathe in this house. I walked out the front door and slammed it behind me, leaving her sobbing on the kitchen floor. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel, tears blurring my vision. Jake wasn't mine. But he was still my son, wasn't he? He was still the boy who called me Daddy, who hugged me every night before bed, who looked up to me like I was his hero. But how was I supposed to love him the same way now? My phone buzzed. It was a message from Ryan. David, I think we need to talk. I stared at the screen, my rage building all over again. I stared at Ryan's message for what felt like hours, my thumb hovering over the screen. David, I think we need to talk. Talk? What did he think we were supposed to talk about? Did he expect some civilized conversation over coffee where we'd clear the air like adults? No. That wasn't going to happen. I tossed the phone onto the passenger seat and started the engine. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stay still. My world was unraveling, and every second felt heavier than the last. For hours, I drove aimlessly around the city. Streetlights blurred into streaks of white and yellow, and the radio played songs I couldn't focus on. My mind was a chaotic storm of Emily's face, Ryan's smug smile, and the cold, clinical words on the DNA test. 0% probability of paternity. By the time I pulled back into the driveway, it was nearly midnight. The house was dark except for the faint glow of the kitchen light. I sat in the car, staring at the window where I knew Emily was probably sitting, waiting for me. When I finally walked inside, she was there. Sitting at the kitchen table, clutching a mug of tea like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Her face was pale, her eyes red and swollen. "Where's Jake?" I asked, my voice cold. "He's asleep," she said softly. "David, we need to talk." I shook my head. "No. You need to talk. And this time, I'm going to listen. Start from the beginning, Emily. Don't leave anything out." She stared into her mug, her hands trembling around it. Then, with a deep breath, she began. "It started almost 7 years ago. You were working long hours. You were so stressed, so distant, and I felt invisible. Ryan, he was around a lot. He listened. He made me feel seen. And one night, it happened." Her voice broke on the last word, and for a moment, I thought she might stop. But she kept going. I regretted it instantly. I felt so guilty, David. I wanted to tell you, but I was scared. And then I found out I was pregnant. I sat down across from her, every word hitting me like a hammer to the chest. "So you knew," I said, my voice sharp and steady. "You knew there was a chance Jake wasn't mine, and you still let me believe he was." Emily nodded, her shoulders shaking as tears spilled down her face. "I wanted him to be yours, David. I prayed every night that he was. And when he was born, and you held him for the first time, I convinced myself it didn't matter. You were his dad. You are his dad." I couldn't listen anymore. I pushed away from the table, pacing across the kitchen. Her words felt like poison in my veins. "Do you have any idea what you've done to me? To us? You didn't just lie, you built our entire life on a lie. Every memory, every moment with Jake, it's tainted now." Emily stood, reaching out as if to touch me, but I stepped back. "David, please. I love you. I love Jake. We can fix this. Please don't let this destroy us." But it was already destroyed. "Fix this? There's no fixing this, Emily. You didn't just cheat on me, you let me love a child under false pretenses. Do you know how cruel that is?" She crumbled into the chair, her head in her hands, sobbing. But I didn't feel sorry for her. Not anymore. "I'm sleeping in the guest room tonight," I said, turning toward the hallway. "And tomorrow, we're going to talk about what happens next." The next morning, I woke up to the sound of Jake's laughter coming from the living room. For a split second, everything felt normal again. But then it all came crashing back. When I walked out, Jake was sitting cross-legged on the carpet, playing with his toy cars. Emily stood in the kitchen, making breakfast, her eyes red and tired. "Morning, Daddy," Jake chirped, holding up a bright red car. I forced a smile. "Morning, buddy." Emily and I exchanged a glance. There was so much unsaid between us, but neither of us wanted Jake to pick up on it. After breakfast, I told Emily I was going out for a bit. She didn't ask where. Maybe she already knew. I ended up parked outside Ryan's office building. My heart was pounding as I walked through the glass doors and took the elevator up to his floor. When I stepped into his office, Ryan was sitting behind his desk, typing on his laptop. He looked up and froze when he saw me. "David," he said cautiously, standing up. I shut the door behind me, locking it. "You and I are going to have a conversation," I said, my voice low. "And you're going to tell me everything." Ryan ran a hand through his hair, avoiding my eyes. "Look, David, I know you're angry." "Angry?" I stepped closer, my fists clenched. "I'm way past angry, Ryan. You slept with my wife. You might have fathered my son. And now you want to play the 'let's talk about it' card." He held up his hands in a placating gesture. "It wasn't planned. I didn't mean for it to happen. And Emily, she loves you, man. She always has." "Don't talk to me about love," I snapped. "You don't get to use that word after what you did." Ryan's face hardened. "What do you want me to say, David?" "I screwed up. I regret it. But Jake's a good kid. And if he's mine, I want to know him." That did it. I lunged forward, grabbing him by the collar and shoving him against the wall. "You don't get to want anything," I hissed. "You lost that right the second you betrayed me." For a moment, I thought about hitting him. But I didn't. I let go, stepping back, my chest heaving. "I hope you're proud of yourself, Ryan. Because whatever happens next, it's on you." I walked out of his office, leaving him standing there, speechless. When I got home, Emily was sitting on the couch, clutching a glass of water like it was her lifeline. "David, did you go see Ryan?" I didn't answer. I just sat down across from her and let out a long, exhausted sigh. "This can't continue," I said finally. "I can't live like this, Emily. I can't look at you without seeing him. And I can't look at Jake without wondering." She flinched, tears welling up in her eyes again. "So what happens now?" she whispered. I stared at her for a long moment before speaking. "We need space. I'll stay at a friend's place for a while. And we'll figure out custody arrangements for Jake." Emily shook her head frantically. "No, David, please. Don't leave. Don't do this to Jake." "This isn't about Jake," I said firmly. "This is about you and me. And there's no us anymore, Emily. You made sure of that." I packed a bag that night. Jake was already asleep, so I kissed his forehead, whispered, "I love you, buddy," and walked out the door. The drive to my friend Sam's place was silent. No radio, no thoughts, just numbness. When I finally walked into Sam's spare room and shut the door behind me, I sank onto the bed and let out a deep, shuddering breath. Everything I had built, everything I thought was mine, it was all gone. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Emily had made her choices. Ryan had played his part. Now it was my turn. The first few days at Sam's place felt like drifting in open water, silent, cold, and endless. Sam tried to keep me distracted, inviting me to watch football or offering to go out for a drink. But I wasn't in the mood for distractions. Most of my nights were spent staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment with Emily and Ryan over and over in my head. Jake's face would flash in my mind, his innocent smile, his little voice calling me Dad, and I'd feel a fresh wave of anger and guilt crash over me. But anger without action is useless. So I decided to channel it. First, I met with a lawyer. I laid everything out, Emily's confession, the paternity test, the years of lies. I wanted custody of Jake. I didn't care what it would take. I wanted to make sure Emily and Ryan didn't get to play house with my son. The lawyer was straightforward. This isn't going to be easy, David. The court usually favors mothers in custody battles, and legally, the DNA results complicate things. But if you're determined, we'll fight. Determined didn't even begin to describe it. Over the next few weeks, I started gathering everything I could. Text messages, old emails, photos, anything that could build my case. I even dug into Ryan's past and found out he'd been caught in a workplace scandal a few years ago, something about misusing company funds. That's when I realized something: Ryan had just as much to lose as Emily. So I played my hand. I sent him an email, short, to the point. Meet me at Miller's Diner at 8 p.m. We need to talk. Come alone. When I walked into the diner, Ryan was already there, sitting in a booth in the corner. He looked nervous, stirring his coffee like it owed him answers. I slid into the seat across from him and folded my hands on the table. David, listen, he started, but I held up a hand. Don't talk. Just listen. I pulled out a folder from my bag and slid it across the table. Inside were screenshots, emails, and records of his little financial mishap. Here's the deal, Ryan. You're going to sign over any claim you think you have to Jake. You're going to walk away from him, from Emily, from everything. And if you don't, I'm sending this to your boss, to your clients, and to anyone else who'll listen. His face turned pale as he flipped through the papers. You wouldn't, I leaned in, my voice low and steady. Try me. Ryan's hand trembled as he reached for a pen. David, please, Save it, I said, cutting him off. You made your choices. Now deal with the consequences. He signed. Right there in that diner, under the flickering fluorescent lights. I took the signed papers, slid them back into my bag, and stood up. Goodbye, Ryan. And just like that, he was out of Jake's life. The days after the custody battle felt like a blur, an exhausting routine of court dates, paperwork, and endless meetings with my lawyer. My focus was sharp, my determination unwavering. I wasn't going to let Emily or Ryan have any say in Jake's life. Emily had made her choices. Ryan had played his role. Now, I was making mine. Every night, I sat at the kitchen table in my small, mostly empty apartment, sifting through files, text messages, and financial records. I had collected every piece of evidence I could find: screenshots of Emily's old texts, a copy of Ryan's signed agreement relinquishing his rights, and even testimonies from friends who had noticed the cracks in our marriage long before I did. I didn't sleep much. The weight of everything pressed down on me, but I couldn't afford to stop. One night, after hours of staring at legal documents, I realized I was out of coffee. It was nearly midnight, but I grabbed my keys and headed to the only 24-hour convenience store nearby. The place was nearly empty, just a bored cashier scrolling through her phone and a woman crouched near the shelves, inspecting jars of peanut butter like she was solving a crime. I grabbed a can of coffee and headed to the checkout, but something about the woman caught my eye. Her basket was filled with random items: ramen noodles, a carton of milk, a single banana, and a pack of candles. When she finally stood up, our eyes met briefly. She was wearing a gray hoodie and jeans, her brown hair pulled into a messy bun. She looked normal. Tired, maybe. Like someone who was just trying to get through the day. I turned back to the cashier, paid for my coffee, and left. That should have been the end of it. But as I walked back to my car, I noticed the woman standing near an old sedan, her keys in her hand, her head tilted as she stared at one of her tires. Flat. For a moment, I considered just getting into my car and driving away. It wasn't my problem. But something, maybe exhaustion, maybe some lingering thread of decency, stopped me. Need help? I asked, approaching cautiously. She turned, startled, then gave me a sheepish smile. Ah, yeah. I think it's flat. And I don't have a spare. I sighed and glanced at her tire. It was completely shot. Do you have anyone you can call? She shook her head. No, I just moved here. I don't really know anyone yet. Of course. All right, let me see if I can help. I called Sam. It took some convincing, but eventually, he showed up with his pickup truck. Together, we managed to tow her car to a nearby repair shop. By the time it was done, it was nearly 2 a.m. The woman, Clara, as she introduced herself, was sitting in the passenger seat of my car, sipping on a bottle of water. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You didn't have to do all this." "It's fine," I replied, staring at the empty road ahead. "It's been a long week. I needed something to distract me anyway." We didn't talk much on the drive. She seemed to sense that I wasn't in the mood for small talk, and honestly, I appreciated it. When we finally pulled up to her building, she hesitated before getting out. "If you ever need anything." "I don't know, a cup of coffee or someone to complain to, I owe you one." I nodded, but I didn't say anything. She stepped out, gave a little wave, and disappeared into her building. I didn't think about her much after that. My mind was too full of Emily, of Ryan, of Jake, and of the looming court date that could change everything. The court hearings dragged on for weeks. Emily played her part well, the remorseful mother, the woman who had made a terrible mistake but was still deeply devoted to her child. But my lawyer was sharp. We presented everything, the DNA test, Ryan's signed document, Emily's old messages. There were moments when I felt like I might break. When Emily would cry on the stand or when Jake's name would be brought up in sterile, clinical tones by lawyers in suits. But every time I felt like falling apart, I'd remind myself of Jake's face, the way he smiled when I picked him up from school, the way he held my hand so tightly when he was scared. He was worth every second of this fight. One Saturday morning, I found myself wandering aimlessly through a local farmer's market. Jake was with Emily for one of her supervised visits, and I couldn't stand being in the silent apartment. The sun was bright, and the smell of fresh bread and coffee hung in the air. I stopped at a stall to buy some strawberries when I heard someone call my name. "David." I turned around and saw Clara standing there, holding a bag of produce. She was wearing sunglasses and a green sundress, and for a split second, I didn't recognize her without the tired hoodie and messy bun. "Hey," I said, surprised. "Clara, right?" She smiled. "Yeah. I didn't expect to see you here." We ended up walking through the market together, talking casually about nothing in particular, how overpriced organic honey was, how crowded the place was, how neither of us really liked kale but felt obligated to buy it anyway. It was easy. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. Eventually, she glanced at her phone and sighed. "I should go. I've got about a dozen things I need to get done today." "Yeah, me too," I lied. She hesitated for a moment, then said, "Take care of yourself, David." "You too, Clara." As she walked away, I realized something strange. I didn't feel the crushing weight of betrayal or anger in that moment. I just felt calm. But calm doesn't last long when you're living in the aftermath of betrayal. Because 2 days later, I got a call from my lawyer. "David, we've got a problem. Emily's lawyer is trying to claim emotional instability on your part. They're arguing that your anger towards Emily makes you an unfit parent." And just like that, the storm came crashing back. I hung up the phone, my hands shaking with fury. Emily wasn't done fighting. And if she thought I was going to let her win, she had another thing coming. The call from my lawyer stayed with me for days, sitting in my chest like a stone. Emotional instability. That's what Emily's lawyer was claiming. That my anger, my frustration, and the sheer exhaustion I'd carried since this mess started somehow made me an unfit father. I could have laughed if it didn't make me so furious. After everything she had done, after the lies, the betrayal, and the mess she created, I was the problem now. I wasn't going to let her win, not this time. The next day, I met with my lawyer, Mark, in his cramped office downtown. "They're going to paint you as unstable, overly emotional, and unable to provide a stable environment for Jake," he said, flipping through a stack of papers. "Emily's team is going to dig into everything, your social media, your text messages, even your interactions with her during supervised visits." I ran a hand through my hair, barely holding back my frustration. "And what do we do about it?" Mark leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "We fight back. We build our own narrative. Emily's not exactly spotless, and we have the evidence. But you, David, you need to keep your cool. Northwest outbursts in court, no emotional reactions when she starts twisting the story." Easier said than done. That weekend, Jake had his supervised visit with Emily. I dropped him off at the visitation center and sat in my car in the parking lot, staring at the building like it was some kind of monster. When Jake came running back to me a few hours later, his little backpack bouncing against his shoulders, I forced a smile and knelt down to hug him. "Did you have fun, buddy?" "Yeah," he said, his voice bright. "Mom bought me ice cream, and we played board games." His excitement was genuine, and it made my chest ache. Emily could play the role of doting mother for 2 hours, but I'd seen behind the curtain. On Sunday, I went for a walk. I needed air, space, something to stop my mind from spiraling. I ended up in a small coffee shop tucked away on a quiet street corner. It smelled like fresh espresso and pastries, and it was blissfully quiet compared to the noise in my head. I ordered a black coffee and sat by the window, staring out at the rain lightly tapping against the glass. "David." I looked up, and there she was, Clara. She was holding a steaming mug and wearing an oversized sweater that looked like it had been knitted by someone's grandmother. "Oh," I said, caught off guard. "Hey, Clara." She hesitated, then nodded toward the empty chair across from me. "Mind if I join you?" "Sure. Go ahead." She set her cup down and slid into the chair. For a moment, neither of us said anything. "Rough day?" she asked eventually, her voice gentle. I let out a tired laugh. "Rough month. Rough year, actually." She didn't push. Instead, she stirred her coffee and looked out the window with me. After a while, I found myself talking, just bits and pieces at first. About the custody battle, about how Emily's lawyer was trying to use my anger against me, about how I felt like I was walking a tightrope every single day. Clara listened. She didn't interrupt, didn't try to fix anything. She just listened. When I finally stopped, I felt lighter. Not better, exactly, but lighter. "You know," she said after a pause, "sometimes the best thing you can do isn't to fight harder, it's to fight smarter. Stay calm, stay focused, and remember why you're fighting in the first place." I nodded slowly, letting her words sink in. When we finished our coffee, Clara stood up first. "Hang in there, David." She walked out into the rain, pulling her hood up over her head. I sat there for a few more minutes, staring at the empty mug in front of me. She was right. The next few weeks were brutal. Court hearings, lawyer meetings, supervised visits, it all blended into one long, exhausting cycle. But I stayed calm. I kept my voice steady in the courtroom. I didn't let Emily's lawyer bait me into emotional outbursts. Emily, on the other hand, was starting to crack. During one of the hearings, her lawyer brought up text messages Emily had sent to Ryan while we were still married. Mark had printed them out, highlighted every line where she'd lied to me, manipulated me, and plotted behind my back. Emily's face went pale as the messages were read aloud. At one point, she glanced at me across the courtroom. Her eyes were pleading, her expression desperate. But I didn't flinch. This wasn't about her anymore. It wasn't about Ryan. It was about Jake. One night, after an especially long day in court, I was sitting at home when I got a message on my phone. It was from Clara. "Hey. I know you've got a lot on your plate, but if you ever need a break, just an hour away from everything, I'll be at the same coffee shop tomorrow morning. No pressure." I stared at the message for a long time before replying. "Thanks, Clara. I might just take you up on that." The next morning, I showed up at the cafe. Clara was sitting by the window, a cup of coffee in front of her and a book in her hand. She looked up when she saw me, smiling softly. "Hey," I said, sliding into the chair across from her. "Hey," she replied, setting her book down. We didn't talk about the custody battle. We didn't talk about Emily or Jake. We just talked. About nothing and everything. About music, about weird movies we both liked, about how overpriced coffee had become. For an hour, I felt normal. When I left the cafe, I realized something important. I didn't have to carry this weight alone. Clara wasn't some savior sent to fix my life, and she wasn't someone I was falling for. Not yet. But she was someone who made things feel a little less heavy. And for now, that was enough. The next court hearing was scheduled for the following week. Mark said we were in a good position, but I wasn't letting my guard down. Emily wasn't finished fighting. But neither was I. And when it came to Jake, when it came to protecting my son, she had no idea how far I was willing to go. The week leading up to the final custody hearing felt like a pressure cooker about to explode. My lawyer, Mark, was confident, but I wasn't letting my guard down. Emily had shown over and over again that she wasn't above playing dirty, and I knew she still had cards left to play. Jake was with Emily for one of his supervised visits. I spent those hours staring at my phone, expecting it to buzz with some catastrophic news. But it didn't. When I picked Jake up later that evening, he was quiet. Not sad, not upset, just quiet. As we walked back to the car, I glanced down at him. "Everything okay, buddy?" He shrugged. "Mom said you don't like her anymore. She said you're angry all the time because of her." I froze mid-step, my stomach twisting into knots. "Jake, listen to me," I said, kneeling down to his level. "Whatever happens between me and your mom, it's not your fault. And I'm not angry at you. I could never be angry at you." Jake nodded, but I could tell the words lingered in his head. Emily was planting seeds, trying to twist the narrative in ways that made her look better. It wasn't working. The day before the final hearing, Mark and I sat across from each other in his office, papers and files scattered across the desk. "David, we have everything we need. Emily's lies, Ryan's statements before he disappeared from the picture, your financial stability, and even Jake's school counselor vouching for your emotional support." But, I hated that word. But what? Emily's lawyer is bringing in a character witness. Someone who claims to have seen you lose control during one of the custody exchanges. I clenched my jaw. That never happened. I know. But they're going to spin it. So whatever happens tomorrow, stay calm. No matter what they say, no matter what they bring up, stay calm. I nodded, my fists clenched so tightly my knuckles turned white. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at an old family photo. Jake was about 3 in the picture, wearing a ridiculous dinosaur costume while Emily and I smiled at him. It felt like another lifetime. The next morning, I walked into the courthouse with my head held high. Emily was already there, sitting next to her lawyer, her eyes fixed on her hands. She glanced up at me briefly, her face pale, but I looked away. The hearing began, and Mark presented our side with precision. He painted a picture of stability, consistency, and love. He highlighted Emily's lies, her infidelity, and the ways she had used Jake as a pawn in her games. But then Emily's lawyer stood up. They called their character witness. It was Sam. My best friend. The guy who had been by my side since this mess began. I felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. Sam avoided my eyes as he walked to the stand. He fidgeted with his watch, his shoulders slumped. "Mr. Hayes," Emily's lawyer began. "Would you describe David as an emotionally stable person?" Sam hesitated. "David's been through a lot. He's under a lot of pressure." "That's not what I asked," the lawyer pressed. "Is David emotionally stable?" Sam swallowed hard. "Sometimes he loses his temper. But it's always because he cares about Jake." "Has he ever acted aggressively in front of Jake?" Sam paused for too long. "No," he finally said. "But the damage was done." Emily's lawyer nodded and stepped back. When Sam walked past me to leave the stand, I caught his eye. He looked like he wanted to apologize, but no words came out. I didn't have the energy to be angry at him. After a short break, the judge returned to deliver her verdict. She ruled in my favor. Primary custody was granted to me, with Emily receiving supervised visitation rights. The relief was overwhelming, but it was mixed with exhaustion. Emily's face crumpled as the ruling was read aloud. She clutched the edge of the table, her lawyer whispering something in her ear. For a brief moment, our eyes met. And then she looked away. That night, I picked Jake up from my sister's house. He was sitting on the living room floor, building something out of Lego bricks. When he saw me, he jumped up and ran into my arms. "Are we going home, Dad?" he asked. "Yeah, buddy. We're going home." The next few weeks were quiet. Emily's visits with Jake were awkward but civil. She played her part, but something was off. Her energy was gone, and her smile never quite reached her eyes. Meanwhile, Sam had tried reaching out to me several times. Texts, calls, voicemails. I ignored them all. One afternoon, as I sat on the park bench watching Jake play on the swings, a familiar voice called out to me. David. I turned and saw Clara approaching with 2 cups of coffee in her hands. I figured you'd be here, she said, handing me one of the cups. Thanks, I said, accepting it. She sat down beside me, her gaze following Jake as he laughed with another kid on the playground. So, how are things? She asked. I sighed, staring down at the cup in my hands. Complicated. But better. That's all anyone can hope for, she said softly. We sat there in comfortable silence for a while, the autumn wind brushing through the trees around us. Eventually, Jake ran over, his face flushed from running around. Dad. Can we stay a little longer? Sure, buddy. Go have fun. As Jake ran back to the swings, Clara smiled. He's a great kid, she said. Yeah, I replied, a small smile tugging at my lips. He really is. Clara stood up, brushing some leaves off her jeans. I should go. But, David, you're doing a good job. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. She walked away before I could respond, her long shadow trailing behind her in the setting sun. I watched her leave, then turned my attention back to Jake. The storm was starting to clear, but I knew the damage it had left behind would take time to repair. For now, though, we had peace. And that was enough. The weeks after the custody battle settled into a quiet rhythm. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was stable. Jake adjusted surprisingly well to the new arrangement, and I could feel the tension in our home easing a little each day. Emily stuck to her supervised visits, though she still felt like a shadow lingering just beyond the edges of our life. But it wasn't Emily I found myself thinking about in those quiet moments after Jake went to bed, it was Clara. We kept running into each other. At the park, at the grocery store, even once at a gas station. It felt natural, like the universe was nudging us into the same space again and again. Eventually, we stopped pretending it was coincidence and started texting. It wasn't flirtatious. It wasn't romantic. At least, not yet. But it was consistent. One evening, as Jake was fast asleep and the house was filled with nothing but the hum of the refrigerator, my phone buzzed. Clara, I'm at the coffee shop. Could use some company. I didn't even hesitate. The cafe was mostly empty when I arrived. Clara was sitting in the corner by the window, her fingers wrapped around a steaming mug. Her eyes were distant, her usually calm expression replaced with something heavier. Hey, I said, sliding into the chair across from her. She looked up, and for a moment, it seemed like she was trying to decide whether to speak or stay silent. You ever feel like you're just holding your breath every day? She asked softly. I leaned back in my chair, nodding slightly. Yeah. More times than I can count. Clara took a shaky breath and looked down at her mug. I have a son. His name is Alex. He's 5. I didn't say anything, letting her continue at her own pace. He was born with cerebral palsy. It's not severe, but he has difficulty walking, and he needs a lot of physical therapy. He's smart, brilliant, actually, but his dad couldn't handle it. She paused, her voice trembling as she spoke. When Alex was 2, my husband left. He said he didn't sign up for this. He said it was too much, too hard, and he couldn't watch our son struggle every day. So he walked away. Her eyes welled up with tears, but she blinked them back. I haven't said that out loud in a long time, she whispered. The weight of her words settled over the table, and I felt something crack open in my chest. Clara. I'm so sorry, I said softly. She looked up at me, her expression raw but steady. It's okay. I've made peace with it, mostly. But some days, it's hard. Some days, it feels like the world expects you to smile and keep moving, even when it feels impossible. For a long moment, we just sat there in silence. The cafe buzzed faintly around us, cups clinking, soft conversations drifting from nearby tables, but all I could focus on was Clara and the pain etched into her face. "Do you ever get scared?" I asked finally. "Every day," she admitted. "But Alex he's everything. His smile, his determination, it makes everything worth it." Her voice broke on the last word, and a tear slipped down her cheek. Without thinking, I reached across the table and gently took her hand. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The world outside the cafe window kept moving, indifferent to the quiet moment unfolding between us. After that night, Clara and I started talking more. Some days, we'd meet at the park while Jake played and Alex sat in his stroller, watching the other kids with wide, curious eyes. Other times, we'd talk late into the night over text. It wasn't romantic, at least not yet. It was something else. Two people finding comfort in each other's company after walking through their own versions of hell. One evening, I invited Clara and Alex over for dinner. Jake was thrilled to have a new friend, and Alex, though shy at first, eventually warmed up to him. Clara and I stood in the kitchen as the boys played in the living room, their laughter echoing through the house. "This feels nice," Clara said, her voice soft. "Yeah," I replied, watching the kids through the doorway. "It does." When it was time for them to leave, Jake gave Alex a hug, and Clara lingered in the doorway for a moment. "Thanks for tonight, David. It's been a long time since things felt normal." I smiled. "Anytime, Clara." The shift between us happened slowly, like the turning of a page. One rainy afternoon, we found ourselves at the park again. The kids were playing, Jake helping Alex navigate the wet grass while Clara and I stood under a tree, sharing a single umbrella. "Sometimes I think about how different life could have been," she said quietly. "If Alex had been born without his condition. If his dad had stayed. But then he wouldn't be Alex," I said. She turned to look at me, her eyes searching mine. "No, he wouldn't," she said softly. We stood there, the rain pattering softly against the umbrella, the world around us blurred by the mist. And then it happened. It wasn't planned, it wasn't dramatic, it just happened. I leaned down, and Clara leaned up, and our lips met in a kiss so gentle, so fragile, it felt like it might shatter if either of us breathed too hard. When we pulled away, her eyes were bright, her cheeks flushed. I should check on Alex," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Yeah," I replied, my voice just as unsteady. We walked back to the boys, neither of us saying much, but the air between us felt different now, charged, heavy with something unspoken. When Clara and Alex left the park that day, I watched her car disappear down the road, my heart beating harder than it had in years. That night, as I tucked Jake into bed, he looked up at me with sleepy eyes. "Dad." "Yeah, buddy. I like Alex. And I like Miss Clara too." I smiled, brushing his hair back. "Me too, Jake."